Hello everyone, I hope you're doing really well. Thank you so much for making some time and joining us here on this Sunday. My name is Hunter Cardinal. I'm from the Sucker Creek Cree First Nation. I am half of the sibling team behind Lake of the Strangers, as well as a new show called câpân, which I'm here to talk with you about. We are calling to you all live from the Roxy Theater here on Gateway, which is located on Treaty 6 territory, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta's Region 4, which has been and continues to be the home of many Indigenous people since time immemorial. And we do this to invite you all on the journey that we're on of being and becoming better treaty people. As well, what's cool is that this area that we're calling from is known by many nations as a gathering place. For the Cree or the Nehewak, we call this a pehonan, a waiting place, a gathering place, where we would come, we would travel to come here specifically to share stories, to trade, to do ceremonies. And today, kind of what we're doing is something sort of similar, where we get to kind of share some stories, we get to gather in this digital way. So it's really exciting to be continuing that tradition. So thank you so much. And then I also want to recognize that we share this territory with our non-human relations as well. So we're talking about the winged, we're talking about the four-legged, the finned and the rooted. So I want to say hi, thank you for that and our relationships there. I also, speaking of relationships, want to introduce everyone in the studio right now. So if you want to give a wave, everyone, we have Hannah, we have Alana, we have Scott, we have Brad, we have me counting right here. Hello, everyone. We also have Theater Network folks supporting us from all over Edmonton and this building. So we just wanted to say we're here, we're really excited, and we're really thankful that you're joining us. To start off in a good way, what we thought would be fun and important is to start off by doing a smudge ceremony. And invite you all to join us from your homes, a digital smudge. It'll be very exciting. Before I dive into that, I wanted to provide a little bit of context about what a smudge ceremony is. So one of the reasons we smudge is to cleanse ourselves, to seal out that negativity in our lives, and to seal in the positivity. We also smudge to intention set, to think about what we're going to do, why we're doing it, and the values that we wish to have kind of guiding us. And we also smudge to bring in our ancestors, those on the other side, to help us do whatever it is that we're trying to do. Smudging will be different based off of your culture, your family, where you're located. For example, some nations use different medicines than others. Some say you should take off your glasses or your jewelry when you're smudging, and others say that you should always stand when you're smudging. Now, what I've been taught from my family, from my people, is that sincerity is the highest form of prayer. So if you have that above all else, you're good to go. Also been taught that your glasses and your jewelry, that they're part of who you are. So you don't need to take them off if you don't want to. I've also been taught as well that you should try to connect, use whatever you have around you to connect in your own way, even if that means you don't have smudge, you don't have a lighter or anything like that. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to do it, and then I'll run through a quick demonstration, and I'll invite you all to join us. Now, I'm really fortunate to say that the elder that we work with, Elder Francis Whiskey Jack, directed my sister Jacquelyn and I on how to do this smudge ceremony virtually, so I'm really excited to share that with you all. So, time for a demonstration. This is probably the most enthusiastic I've been all week, so I'm really stoked. So I was like, what are we doing? It's like a birthday party. Okay, so what's going to happen is I'm going to be lighting this sage right here, and then you're going to see some smoke come up. Now that smudge right there, that's our connection to the Creator, to all things. Our thoughts and our prayers, they're going to be carried up by the smoke. That's when the Creator is going to hear that and be like, ah, yes, of course. And what's going to happen is then I'm going to, just like I'm washing myself, I'll first probably take off my glasses and give them a little smudge. But what I want to do is I'm going to put my hands in first, and I'm going to be thinking, you know, I want to do things in a good way today. And then I'm going to bring that smudge, that clarity, that cleansing idea to my eyes, to my ears, to my mouth, to my heart, I'll bring it over my body, just thinking about overall health, because we need that now. And then to my legs, to be on the right path in life. And then sometimes I just like to do it once more over, just to seal in that positivity. That's one way to do it. There are many different ways. And also, when I'm doing this, right afterwards, I'll hold it up to the camera for you all to take the time to kind of smudge from the comfort of your own home in front of your computer, where you can bring that clarity to your eyes, your nose, or whatever, to yourself in your own way. Trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's about it. If you don't want to do this, there's no pressure. We just wanted to make this available. Afterwards, I'll say a short prayer. I'll encourage you all to pray in your own way, whatever feels comfortable, whatever helps you center yourself. And without further ado, let's dive into it and let's do a little smudge. So, as I said, I'll light it. Now I'm using a lighter. There are different thoughts about whether or not you should use a lighter or a match. I've been taught that it really doesn't matter, that sincerity is the most important thing, so that's why I'm using the Bic. So. Great. Glasses. So you can kind of see that right here. Perfect. I'm putting it down, so you probably see it coming up with my black sweater. Perfect. So that's how I do it. I invite you all to do it in your own way when I lift it up to the camera right here, and I'll just hold some space for you all at home. Wonderful. So now I'll just say a short prayer. Once again, feel free to pray in whatever way feels comfortable for you. I want to call in our ancestors, those on the other side, and the Creator to come sit with us, to help us learn and imagine in a good way with our hearts and our minds open. I also want to call in the spirits of the stories from long ago and the spirits of the stories from today that we know, that we love, that we cherish, to help us make space for those stories yet to come, for those teachings yet to come, to help us in this very turbulent time that we're in right now, to give us that guidance, to remind us that we're all connected and related, and to help us walking on the path towards the good life. Hai kinanaskomitan. Thank you. Great. Hi, everyone. So thank you for joining me there. I'm really excited because I'm here to help showcase the work that my sister Jacquelyn and I have done so far on the show câpân, to kind of share a little bit about the ideas that we're cooking on, the characters that we have, sort of what research we've been doing, and to share some of the music that's been created by our wonderful collaborators who you'll be seeing very shortly, and I'm very excited about that. But before we do that, I also wanted to say that this serves as sort of a ceremonial moment, an opportunity in a process of us telling this story to kind of pause and reflect and think about, where we've been and also where we're going in the first place, just to make sure that once again we're aligning ourselves with the journey that we set out to do. So before I dive into that, I'm really excited to be here, partly because we're part of Theatre Network's new Indigenous play commissioning program, and câpân is one of the first commissions, which is awesome, and we're being supported by Syncrude, which is wonderful, and basically what this program is set up to do is to commission, develop, and support new plays by Indigenous writers to be produced as a part of Theatre Network's future main stage seasons in the new Roxy Theatre. So we're so excited to be a part of that. We're really stoked to have the support and the resources to tell this story because we're really passionate about it, and we hope that it helps in the future with what we're going through. So thank you so much, Syncrude. Thank you so much, Theatre Network. We're super stoked. Before I dive into everything, I just kind of wanted to provide a little bit of context. You're going to be hearing me talk a lot about Indigenous mythologies, and you're probably going to be like, why is Hunter sort of low-key obsessed about Indigenous myths? Where did that come from? It seems out of balance, but it's not. I swear it is. Basically, my sister and I, we've always loved Indigenous mythologies. We kind of like grew up listening to like very primary or foundational myths that our dad told us, and we've always thought about them. I'm really personally fascinated by things that are really old. My sister loves Indigenous culture and ideas and applying them to today's world. It's what we do in our work outside of theater. So we're really into that, and I think that this kind of started really blossoming for us in around 2017. I happened to be in Toronto at the time, and what I stumbled across was a PDF article written by an elder and knowledge keeper, Wilfred Buck, out of Manitoba. Wilfred's a science instructor and knowledge keeper, and he specializes in Indigenous stories that come from the stars, talking about Indigenous constellations. Now, this whole concept of Indigenous astronomy blew my mind. At the time, I was like, wait a second, what? We have an Indigenous astronomy? And I just kept on, like, I poured through this, this PDF document, and I was so excited because it was sharing all of these constellations that I knew just from my day-to-day, like the Big Dipper or the Little Dipper and so on. But there happened to be really profound, really exciting Indigenous myths woven into those stars. And I was really excited about this because these stories actually happen to be very old as well. Some of them have evidence of going back, 10,000 years to the last ice age. So there I am kind of like looking up at the stars today, being like, oh, that's what my ancestors saw. And in that moment, I felt really connected to that. And I was like, these myths are so cool. Now, in this document, I also read about this concept, this Cree concept of infinity called Misowa. And that blew my mind. I was like, we have a concept of infinity as well? What's going on? So the more that I looked into it, it translated directly into all that is. And what it refers to is all the stories and teachings that have been, that we know today, that are woven into the stars as constellations. Those constellations, those teachings, those stories, they exist in a sea of other stories and teachings that have yet to be created and shared and told in our time to help with the problems that we're dealing with today. So that really provided a strong foundation and kind of spurred my sister and I to dive into Indigenous mythologies, not just because they provide that connection to the past and sort of that cultural continuity, but also it kind of put us smack dab in the middle of not only a connection to all that has been, but all that will be as well. That this process of creation is an ongoing process that has been going on for so long. So this idea of new stories was particularly exciting for my sister and thinking about the future. So that's kind of like a little bit about the foundation of why we're kind of really into myths. So I wanted to provide that. And to kind of like kick things off, we also wanted to share the myth that inspired us to write câpân. So what I'd like to do right now is share with you the story of kind of how the world was recreated. And this was a story, of course, that was told to us by our dad, and we wanted to share that version of it, just so that you kind of have a basis of what inspired us to write câpân, and then kind of how we're adding to it and evolving that story, or not evolving, but expanding, or in some ways completing it, which we'll dive into shortly. But the story that we were told starts after there was this massive, massive flood that covered the earth in a shallow sea. And in this sea, there was this giant turtle swimming. And on its back, there happened to be these animals that were huddled together, hoping for the waters to eventually recede. And among those animals, there was the rabbit, there was the beaver, the loon, the otter, and the muskrat. And they were looking for that land so that they could start to build a new home and continue and kind of get through this very troubling time. So this search went on for a very long time, and they couldn't find anything. Until one day, the Creator came down and told the animals that if you wish to have new land, you wish to find it, you have to dive to the bottom of this sea, underneath the water, and bring up some of the old earth that lies beneath the water and put it on the shell of this turtle. Only then, the Creator said, could you grow new land, and could that new land grow? So after the Creator left, the animals, they all agreed that they would at least try to do this. This was their only hope. So they all said, yes, we'll do this. And they all took turns diving beneath the waves. Now, at the time, the hopes were with the strongest swimmers, so like the otter, for example. But as each animal tried and failed, those hopes turned to despair, until eventually only the muskrat remained untested. And when the muskrat was about to try to dive into the water, they were stopped by the other animals who said, don't bother attempting to try yourself. We'll let the stronger swimmers try and continue to try. Don't worry about it, we've got this. And basically what happened was they continued to try. And that night, when everyone was sleeping off the fatigue of having been basically swimming all day, the muskrat lay awake on its back, looking up at the stars. And in that moment, in that silence, the muskrat realized what he needed to do. So with a splash that awoke the rest of the animals, the muskrat dove into the water to try to retrieve that earth. And all the animals, they called the muskrat, and they looked over and they were trying to see where the muskrat would surface in this dark, swirling water. But as each short moment stretched into a longer one, eventually the animals fell into silence as they just waited and waited and waited. And it wasn't until the sun was in the middle of the sky the next day that they could see something just bobbing off in the distance. And it wasn't until the turtle got closer that they could see the outline of the muskrat. So still in that soundless silence, the animals jumped in to pull the little body of the muskrat onto the shell of the turtle. And as they mourned the loss of their friend, their family member, they started to arrange the muskrat in the center of the turtle shell in alignment with the pathway of the sun to pay respect. But what they noticed was in one of the paws of the muskrat, it was tightly held in a small fist. So out of respect and wanting to kind of like line out that muskrat, to lay him out in a way that was respectful, that honored him, they very gently opened the hand, or the paw rather, of the muskrat. And what they found was in that paw was a little bit of dark earth. So the animals celebrated, and their joy was mixed with so many tears as they put that bit of earth onto the center of the shell. And from that hand, that small amount of earth that came from the muskrat's paw, is the land that we call today, that we live on today. That's where it grew from. So that is the story that we were told, and that's the story that really inspired us to write câpân, which you'll see kind of like how we based this story off of it. For me, hearing that, I grew up on this story, and at first I remember kind of being really sad about that sacrifice, but now as I'm older, kind of reflecting on, there was that moment where the muskrat did consciously decide to make that sacrifice. And I just find that to be really powerful, and how that decision was kind of decided. And what also really stands out to me now, listening to that, is just the love that the animals had for each other, of not trying to persuade the muskrat not to go because you're a really bad swimmer, but to do that to kind of protect them, to be like, don't worry, we've got this, we care for you. So that was really powerful for me. But what always kind of has remained a mystery for us, we really haven't found many stories that tell us why, or any for that matter, was how the animals got to the back of the turtle in the first place. It kind of just starts after there had been tons of narrative action. So we were like, how did that happen? So on a very high level, the tale that we want to tell of câpân is the tale of how the animals got to the back of the turtle. And we want to tell this through the lens of a group of teenagers making their way through the last ice age here on Turtle Island, or North America, around 10,000 years ago, or 12,000. And what's happening is these teenagers, they're on an extended rite of passage, going from being a teenager, from basically not being a child anymore, but not quite an adult, and all the internal change that happens there that we're all familiar with. But also for a greater rite of passage for humanity as well, because that was a very important time in our collective history. And why we picked that time and that age was because we found that this really kind of mirrors at least our experience of COVID-19. Of when this first rolled around, we really saw and felt that this was essentially like an apocalypse. And the world that we knew before was essentially gone. But the world that was going to be in the future hadn't arrived yet. So we were in this very interesting in-between place. And what we're trying to do with câpân, once again on that high level, is to answer the question of what do we need to begin rebuilding the world once the old one has been swallowed up. So this story is a story that is very strongly purpose-driven. It's almost a design problem where we're trying to specifically answer that question. And what we're hoping to do is answer that question on a journey that takes place from Glacial Lake Peace, which is kind of where Lesser Slave Lake is today. It's what Lesser Slave Lake used to be, but much bigger. So a journey from Glacial Lake Peace all the way to the peaks of the Rocky Mountain. So that's what câpân is on a very high level. But what we wanted to do is really immerse everyone and introduce them in the world by sharing some of the most rad music from the most rad collaborators, Kris and Jason, who I'd love to bring up right now. We're gonna hear their music, and then they're also gonna share with us kind of what their process has been and a little bit more about the pieces that you'll be hearing. So, Kris, Jason, hello. Great to see ya.
Hey, nice to see you.
Yo, yeah, did you guys want to introduce yourself, share a little bit more about yourselves, where you're from, maybe even some other things where you call home today, and then we can dive into the music that you created.
Hey,
Jay?
Sure. Hey, I'm Jason Borys. Today I'm coming to you from out in Leduc here. Super excited to be here. I'm an audio engineer and modular synthesis, in this case, working with Kris Harper in our project AG47. We're super excited to be here and show you some of the music that we've been working on in regards to the story that Hunter's been telling. It's been a pretty exciting couple weeks, 3 or 4, it's about 3 weeks. We've been diving hard into the story and really trying to connect with, how we can support this story and this glacial world that he's talking about. Anyways, Jason Borys, super excited to introduce my partner, Kris Harper.
Yo, hey, yeah, I'm Kris Harper from Amiskwashi, Treaty 6 territory. I'm a musician and I do a bit of woodwork as well. But yeah, we're here just to pretty much talk about this incredible project that we're working on and the music that we've been kind of creating for it. The AG47 has been kind of a new project for Jason and I in the past couple of years to really focus a lot of our efforts and kind of like expand as to where we saw ourselves as musicians, to try to like push into areas that were maybe outside of our comfort zone, including the occasional production with Hunter and Jacquelyn, which has been just such an honor. And yeah, we're so happy to be here. Thanks so much for having us.
No worries. Yeah, it's a pleasure. So, shall we dive into at least the first chunk of what you've created, and then we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what was behind that and sort of that process?
Sure.
All right. So, let's dive into it.
Hey.
Perfect. Okay, that was so amazing. All right, let's dive into it. So sort of what has been your process and your approach to creating what we just heard?
Well, I think I'll start by saying that there was kind of a lot of the conceptual concepts that we were putting into this idea. Like, there's when we heard this story, and this wasn't actually the first time, obviously, because this is like an old very old story that, again, as Hunter mentioned, many families have carried on throughout the generations. But there is this kind of interesting concept about telling this story, and something that Jason and I and Hunter and Jacquelyn, we've all spoken about, and this idea of it being happening a long time ago, 10,000 years or more. But then at the same time, as that reality is sometimes referred to as archaic or prehistoric or all these kind of terms, we were thinking it in this way that's actually like high tech, like in some ways maybe the highest tech that we've actually kind of come down from. So in some ways the music was intended to be a little bit in this electronic but also timeless space. Like we were trying to use instruments, use sounds that were, again, not so easy to place as to where this was, what year this was, all this kind of stuff. So that's a few words. I'll let Jason take over.
Yeah, definitely. Especially with the first starting piece you heard, we're really trying to focus on a somber and proud sort of vibe that would come, with making a sacrifice like that. And sacrifices for our family and stuff. We all make these types of sacrifices, and though it sounds somber, it's really, I think we're trying to instill a proud vibe in that doing these things where we sacrifice for our family are the greatest things that we can do. And part of the way that we make these sounds is through using modular synthesis. Just briefly to describe that, that's what I've got in behind here. Similar to a traditional synthesizer that comes in a box ready to play, this is like the guts of something like that. So these are all the circuits that are inside these mass-produced keyboards. One of the things that Kris and I try to do in all of our projects is to make sure that all the sounds that we use are very much are not just our own, but also all of ours. It's always been important to us in our writing sessions to be thinking about, how can we be the best antennas that we can be, to have, open hearts and open minds to connect, with the spirit world and bring in these help from our ancestors to work with these circuits. Because of the open nature of these circuits, you take patch cables and patch them together, and they have touch points. You become a part of this electrical current, a part of this electrical circuit, and that goes beyond just our bodies. So that's why it's very, very excited to start with the smudge today and bring that in here, because that's something that Kris and I are very guided by in these sessions. A lot of times we don't really feel so much like we're writing. We go in with intent, but arms as antennas, and try and be as open as we can to be pure and pure of heart with this stuff. And another thing we were thinking of in the stuff that in those last bit of songs was the age of these characters. Wanting to keep a bit of, I know that first piece was a bit dark, but I'm glad we put that at the front because the rest of the stuff is maybe a little lighter. But also, because of the youthfulness, I want to think about the usefulness of dance music and how dance brings us together. The dance floor is a healing place. And so it's just exciting to share this process with Hunter and Jacquelyn, and I couldn't be more excited for all of this. Stoked for everybody to hear the next bit of stuff.
Why don't we dive right into that? We'll play the second bit. Okay, so yeah, that was so amazing. Any immediate thoughts? Like, I had one quick question for you, but if you wanted to just kind of dive in about sort of the inspiration behind what we just heard right there, that'd be so amazing.
Yeah, so with these pieces, what we were really thinking about is, what does this environment sound like? What are the environmental noises around? So that's why a couple of these pieces are a little more minimal in sound, you know. So we're definitely thinking about this, the sound of ice, and what it sounds like on the water to be cresting over the waves, as the hum of this world, uh, so distant from us, pulses on. And again, to go back to the modular synth, I think that's why this is a nice instrument to be using for this, because these oscillators are built upon waves and cresting sounds, and yeah, and also in the first piece, the little chirping noises of like, what are the little bugs that are happening in this, you know, in this world. Yeah, so these were much more environmental sort of feelings that we were really trying to channel in this stuff, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I was going to mention there was a couple instances where there's some voice, and we've been talking with Hunter and Jacquelyn about this concept as well. I'm a singer, so I mean we're all singers, but um, we had talked with Hunter about this, about maybe creating voice parts, or helping to assist write voice parts that work with this music in some cases, that would be sung by the cast. As well as, I mean, I'd be there as well, so I'd be happy to be another voice in that. But just to be thinking about how we can utilize human voices in all of this work as well. But definitely, just to go back to some of this modular synthesis concept as well, there's something about, like, for instance, when Jay mentioned buying synthesizer that is fully created, fully built out of the box, there is something that places that sound, the sounds that you hear from that synthesizer, into a time period. Whereas with modular synthesis, we're trying to get closer and closer to that raw waveform that then is treated from the raw state, so that it becomes this thing that's very difficult to decipher for music lovers or makers, creators. It can be hard to decipher era, time periods, things like this, and this it just becomes a part of the language, and allows us to think about this music as a very big character, to help guide all kinds of things, environmental as mentioned, but also character and specific stories. So okay, and this has been like kind of, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but it seems to be one of the coolest projects that I've been involved in. And
Agreed. Yeah, agreed.
yeah, this has just been such a unique place for Jason and I to be able to create in, because so often it's kind of put onto us as to what's being said, what is being conveyed with the music or the sound. And this time it's like we're helping with many other people to help create this story, which just feels just that much more powerful, that much more involvement, and with all these different energies from coming from different areas concentrated into one kind of ray. This is kind of like just feels like very important work. And anyway, we're very honored to share, and thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, no, thank you both so much for being here. If there's any last words that you wanted to share, you can go for it. But other than that, thank you so much for the great work and also the great thoughts afterwards. It's really exciting, and it totally helped immerse us into the world that we're going to be exploring. So, hi.
Thank you.
Much love.
Thank you.
Great. So that was real cool. If we're diving into this world, one thing that we wanted to just get out of the way really quickly is that we're dealing with a culture that Jacquelyn and I have called the sakāwithiniwak, or the circle people, or how I like to describe it as the circle builders. So this is a pre-Ice Age culture that we're saying existed at the same time as the Clovis culture around the last Ice Age. And of course, you're going to be seeing some images here around that time period. But what we're imagining is that these Waskianuak people, they're proto-Cree, as in they predated the Cree, and the Cree culture today, we could say, theoretically, derives itself from this older, more like a primary culture that existed long before. Now, one thing that's very important about this is that they actually didn't exist. This is totally imaginary. I think Jacquelyn, Kris, Jason, we're all really inspired by, some of the stories that we've been hearing today that are in our popular media, like the Black Panther. That whole realm of Wakanda, the history that's connected to that. We were really inspired by just how far their imaginations went, how limitless their images were about what an indigenous culture could look like if it had the chance to really grow in its own way without any impact from colonization that we would know today. How would they organize themselves? How would they create music? What would their economies be like? How would they consider information and how to share it and transfer it? With the Waskianuak, those are some of the questions that we get to answer, and that Jacquelyn, as playwright and the one kind of driving the ship, gets to start chewing with, which is really exciting for me. So as you saw in some of the images, we're also not only dealing with just a sort of a new culture, but we're also dealing with sort of a new landscape as well. During the last Ice Age, things were extremely different. We had glaciers that were covering most of Canada today and most of the continent of North America, which impacted the sea levels off the coast of the country and also the coast of North America. This is a picture in Patagonia of a glacier, just so that you can get the sense of just how massive these glaciers are and the impact that they had on the environment. And once again, I'm just thinking of the music that we just heard. You can totally hear the shifts and the cracks and the pops of the ice. So that's really exciting. And of course, accompanying these glaciers in the landscape are these massive glacial lakes that sort of popped up, and that a lot of the lakes that we know today are remnants of. So Lesser Slave Lake is actually the remnant of a larger glacial lake, much larger, called Glacial Lake Peace. So that's sort of where we're going to be setting our story, just around the shores there, probably in the Swan Hills area. We're not quite sure yet. We're doing a lot of research. There is a lot of archaeological findings around the Swan Hills area, so we're thinking, hey, maybe that's where the Waskianuak, at least a part of that larger culture that spanned North America, maybe that's where our part of the story would begin. And then accompanying that landscape, we also have a lot of non-human relations. So not only just the flora, but the fauna. We had megafauna at this time, giant animals like the short-faced cave bear that you're seeing right here. Just a massive 3-meter tall, huge killing machine that's just terrifying. So they were just roaming around in the plains and everywhere. So we're doing research into what the habitat and the lifestyle of those giant creatures were. We also have another example would be the giant beaver. They grew out to be like 7.2 feet long. Like, they were just massive. So we're really starting to say, like, hey, the relationships that we had as human beings with all these different animals must have been very specific, considering that it wasn't the same animals that we know today. Another one that I love is what you're looking at is a giant ground sloth, and these critters, even though they're like 3 meters tall, they were basically found all throughout North America and South America in caves. They are huge, and I can't, for me, just as someone who loves this time period, like, isn't it nuts that we used to like share the land with animals like these? And we're like, we haven't changed for like 250,000 years. So, like, what? Anyways, it's a miracle that we're here. Miracle, very thankful. So those are some of the non-human relationships that we're going to be exploring in this story, some of the materials that we get to work with, which is really exciting. As you can tell, I get really nerdy about this. You should see Jackie. She's worse. No, I'm the worst. Anyways, so with the characters, what we wanted to do is we wanted to use sort of the pre-existing architecture of the myth to kind of inspire what the characters' traits would be like. So we have a really unique ensemble that, of course, is very intentional about who we picked and why. So we're going to have characters that are inspired by the animals on the back of the turtle. And I'll explain what that means. So we're going to have animals that are inspired by, or rather characters that are inspired by animals that you heard in the myth that we just shared, which is the beaver, the otter, the rabbit, the loon, as well as the muskrat. But Jacquelyn and I, we also want to include animals like the frog and the monarch butterfly. So what we're doing is we're researching kind of like biologically what these animals were like, what we know about them to help influence their character traits as individuals, as people. So for example, the monarch butterfly, which is one that Jacquelyn had a particular affinity with and that is exploring right now, it's often described as a wanderer. So it migrates really long distances during the fall and then returns once again. The monarch flight has been described as slow and sailing. So once again, character clues. It also goes through 4 stages of complete metamorphosis, going from the egg, the larvae or the pupa, to the adult. So we're looking at those key, almost like clues, to inform what these characters could be like. And what we're hoping to have is, once again, a very intentional set of characters that are unique, that are dynamic, that grow, and that, of course, are connected to that initial myth that we shared at the very beginning. So that's just a little bit about the characters and the world. But we wanted to kind of expand a little bit more on just our process. So you know about the story that we're going to be telling, but we wanted to kind of share how we're approaching this and sort of what's guiding this process. So first off, Jacquelyn and I, we really got into what we call myth architecture, and I'll explain that in a little bit, but we got into telling stories through extensions of teachings that we kind of gained over the years, particularly from a knowledge keeper named Jade Tatusis. I heard her speak, and she's this fantastic traditional dancer, activist, incredible human. And she was explaining in this interview about why she dances. And I just thought it was so powerful, because what she said was, she dances for those who cannot dance. And I thought that idea of responsibility was super interesting. And Jacquelyn and I were just kind of like, whoa, and we applied it to what we do as storytellers, and it sort of transformed, and Jacquelyn came up with this of we tell stories for those, that storytellers rather, they tell stories for those who need them. So within that idea of storytelling, we're not just telling stories because we want to, but because someone in their life would need something. And we've often believed that storytelling is a form of medicine, so that what we're doing, we have sort of like an obligation to do it in a good way. I loved what Jason was talking about with arms up like antennas. That's kind of a great way of putting it. What we're doing is we've coined this term called myth architecture, and my sister can talk about this at length, but basically it begins with a question that we have that feels really important but doesn't have an answer. And it challenges us to craft a narrative or a story that responds to that question in some sort of way. So it often looks like completing, expanding, or setting up a pre-existing myth. So for those of you who got to see Lake of the Strangers back in 2019, which feels like a decade ago, thanks COVID, that was basically completing the myth of Mista Muskwa, which was the story that we can associate from the Cree perspective, and a lot of other cultures as well, with the story of the Big Dipper or Ursa Major. And that story is about this massive bear that kind of ravaged the land, what happened to it, and we wanted to kind of come in and explain how that story ends. And what we were trying to do, our question in this mythic architectural process was, why should we heal when there is so much darkness? So for us, that's what was driving the creation of Lake of the Strangers. It was actually trying to answer that question with no expectation in the process that we actually could answer it. which is a very exciting process. And once again, I respect the work that Jacquelyn does in creating these stories and daring to ask these questions. Because sometimes, you may not like the answer that you get. So this process that we have, that kind of explains the reasons why we're doing this. We're following a particular process that we call the Misowa Method. And what this method is it's rooted in the Cree concept of wakotuin. And what wakotuin is it's the concept of relationality that essentially describes how everything in the universe is interconnected. And this Misowa method is a collaborative way to build community through art. And basically, to explain it on a high level, is an individual or a pair, brother-sister duo, they take a story to explore the truth that they see as individuals. And then what they do is they take that truth and they bring it through all levels of interconnectedness. So we start, of course, with ourselves. We then bring it to our family, ask them, what do you see in this story? What's true for you? They, of course, share and add to the story. They make that truth a little bit more clear. And we continue doing that through adding more and more people, going through our relationships with the communities around us, with the nation, the community of communities, and so on and so forth. And what happens is that story travels through all those levels of connectedness in our relationships and becomes clearer and clearer with each heart and mind that adds to it, that uncovers that truth, that shares that truth. And what's really beautiful is that the ownership of that truth then becomes distributed amongst each person that makes an addition. And the story, by the end of this process, reaches, it becomes essentially a myth that is owned by everyone, like the myths that we know today. We don't really know, what playwright created what myths, because they're all of ours, and we can all see ourselves within it. And what we do at the end of this process is we create a new constellation with this new myth that we place in the stars through ceremony. So that's sort of the process that we're using to help guide the creation of câpân. So when we first started to think about câpân, it actually came through a coffee that Jacquelyn and I had in 2017 at District Cafe. Man, I wish I could go there. It's been a long time. But anyways, so we had this coffee, and in this coffee, we were talking about stories, and we actually came up with the concepts behind 5 stories. First, it was Lake of the Strangers. Then we came up in that same conversation with a story called The Sun Travelers. Then we had a story called câpân, and then we had another story called Achako, and then another one to kind of wrap things up. And those stories, they all exist in the same fictional universe. And we were really intentional with, what stories we wanted to tell first. For us, it made sense that we could tell a story like Lake of the Strangers first. It would be a one-man show in theater, and it was like, okay, we could for sure do that. It would be a stretch, but I think we could do that. And then we were thinking, it'd be really great if we could tell Sun Travelers next. That's going to be more of a musical that would be closer to contemporary times, so like modern day. Right now, we don't know if it's going to be pre or post-COVID. And then we have câpân, which would happen way, 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 way in the past. And then we'd have Achako happening in the distant future. And that other story kind of happening at a completely different time in a completely different universe. So what we wanted to do was make sure that we told the stories that we could tell first. So the next story after Lake of the Strangers that we were going to write was the story of Sun Travelers, which was that musical that I mentioned before. But then March rolled around in 2020, and with it came COVID-19. And that completely changed everything for Jacquelyn and I. And I remember just the first couple of weeks and the first month, I remember Jacquelyn was really angry and crying the whole time. And I was just terrified and crying the whole time. And we were really feeling like this was an apocalypse of sorts that we were going through, where the world that we knew was completely gone and forever changed. But that world that would come to be had not yet arrived. And we were in that really interesting place, that liminal space. So we wanted to do was look for guidance from history of what are the stories out there that we could use to provide that guidance. And what you're seeing right now is a picture from the Spanish flu or the influenza epidemic that happened 100 years ago. And we were really interested in how our ancestors got through that time. So I started calling up all the câpâns that I have. Câpân means great-grandparents or the great-uncles or great-aunties that one Cree person can have. It's also at the same time the word used for like young, like very small babies that are like great-grandchildren as well. So that's a very interesting idea. I think it's because they're both so close to the spirit world at that point in their lives. Anyways, that's kind of sort of the reasons why we're interested in naming the show câpân. So anyways, back to that. So we were asking, you know, how did our ancestors get through influenza? And what's really interesting is that the stories that were passed down only came through the children that were alive during the Spanish flu. And they didn't really have much of a story to share. All that they could really share was what they saw the adults going through, which they saw the adults wearing masks, wearing gloves, scarves around their faces. They didn't really see many people, and it was a very, very stressful time. They only referred to, after the influenza epidemic was done, they referred to that time as when there was that sickness. And that's it for the stories. I think that there are stories out there, but for our communities, there weren't any that were passed down. So we were kind of like at a loss of like, well, where could we turn? So we looked towards our myths. Maybe there is some sort of apocalypse story that we could really turn to. But as you saw with the story that we shared at the very beginning, a lot of these myths, they kind of start after there was a massive catastrophe, and very few that we were able to find actually starts before. There was a massive change which created a new world. But even then, it wasn't like the apocalypse that we're experiencing now, where there's a great change and we weren't able to find, you know, sort of what are the ideas, the things that we should keep clear in our hearts to help guide us through a massive transformation that is similar to what we're going through now. So what became very clear for us is we're focusing on this concept of liminality. And that's where my sister Jacquelyn, she started doing a lot more research, and we got this excerpt where in anthropology, liminality, it's from the Latin word limen, which means a threshold. It is the quality of ambiguity or disorientation that occurs in the middle stage of a rite of passage when participants no longer hold their pre-ritual status, but have not yet begun the transition to the status they will hold when the rite is complete. During a rite's liminal stage, participants stand at the threshold between their previous way of structuring their identity, time, or community, and a new way which completing the rite establishes. So that's kind of where COVID-19 sort of left us, and we're really noticing that, you know, in terms of the stories that we feel like we need, there's a gap with how to get through a time like this. What do we need to begin to rebuild the world when the old one has been swallowed up? So that was the question that we were really focusing on around this time last year. And when we were thinking about sort of like writing a musical, that was the last thing that we wanted to do because it didn't answer for us that question. So the only real story that we had was just câpân, of a massive change. And for us, we were like, I think that story can help us find an answer to the question that's becoming most clear and apparent to us that we need to answer. But when we were talking about that and starting to consider that, that was a huge story, and we were really intentional about working on Sun Travelers first because it was smaller than câpân in terms of its scope. Câpân travels across like a pre-Ice Age continent with multiple characters. We weren't even considering it being a play. We were considering it being a radio play or a novel of some kind. So we were like, how do you even begin to stage that? So when we were talking with Brad about doing Sun Travelers, and then we're like, we kind of want to do câpân, but we have no idea if we can do that. We remember Brad just being like, you know, don't worry about it. Don't worry about staging about it. We'll worry about that later. Just go for it. So Jacquelyn and I, we looked at each other and we're like, yeah, okay, let's do it. And then that's kind of what launched us into beginning this process. And what's funny is that once we dove into the research, we were actually already had been diving into the research because Jacquelyn and I were really interested in the first place in this very amazing time, the Younger Dryas. And just to provide a little bit of background, the Younger Dryas, and this is a quote, is one of the most well-known examples of abrupt change. About 14,000 years ago, the Earth's climate began to shift from a cold glacial world to a warmer interglacial state. Partway through this transition, temperatures in the northern hemisphere suddenly returned to near glacial conditions. This near glacial period is called the Younger Dryas, named after a flower, Dryas octopetala, that grows in cold conditions and that became common in Europe during this time. The end of the Younger Dryas, about 11,500 years ago, was particularly abrupt. So Jacquelyn and I were always fascinated about this particular time because all of a sudden there was a massive extinction of megafauna, and we're talking about a lot of megafauna and big ones too, like sort of the pictures that we showed you. But there's also the melting of the glaciers at a really extreme rate, and we were always curious about, you know, what happened, how did that happen. We got really into books like written by Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson about this time period, so we were all into that. Really great podcasts on Joe Rogan, and we were really fascinated about this. So the research kind of was already there, and we'd already been doing it. And then we were really, once again, really excited to be in this part of the process right now, which is us world building and getting to create that new culture, almost on that alternative timeline to what happened in this universe, with that really strong, of course, getting to expand and play off of the vibrancy of the Black Panther universe and get to see, well, what would that culture look like had there been no colonization, or an indigenous culture sort of at the height and not being interrupted in their development and their growth. So we also were really excited because it served as an opportunity for us to think about and engage with the teachings that we have today and how they could have been derived from pre-Ice Age Proto-Cree cultures. And one great example of sort of a similar example of this would be what we learned about the grass dance. The grass dance is a really beautiful dance, and if you've seen it, there's a particular style of dancing where the feet are like kind of patting the ground in a particular way. And what we've been told by elders is that this whole ceremony, this whole dance, evolved from when communities were setting up camp. The whole community would go out and be tapping down the grass so that they could set up their teepees in their camp. And then over time, it evolved into this beautiful dance that we know today. So for us, Jacquelyn and I get to look at different parts of our culture and start to think about, well, where did they come from? Perhaps they came from the sakāwithiniwak, from certain events or teachings that they thought were really important. And for us, it could answer questions like, why are our ancestors or our people today, the Woodland Cree or the sakāwithiniwak, why are they called that? Why did our ancestors, when they're thinking about what to call themselves, did they land on trees? Like, definitely there were forests around, but it's very interesting because there's also tons of animals around, rivers, lakes, giant rocks, glaciers. It's very interesting that they picked trees to focus on. And we've been told that there are many teachings about trees, and we're still looking for them and really exploring them right now. So this could be an opportunity to kind of fictionally explore why we're called the sakāwithiniwak. It's one of the great questions that we get to potentially imagine an answer to. So the next steps for us and this project will be us essentially continuing to work on câpân. Jackie, the writer, is just busily working away doing research and everything like that. We're going to be having another online showcase of this story in the new Roxy Theater in November, so stay tuned for that, where we're going to be sharing more of the story, the music, the characters, and it's going to be really exciting to see what we'll have cooked up by then. And then we'll also, at the same time, get to be in the Lauren Cardinal Theater, which I'm personally very excited about. That's so cool. But that's it. That's what we got so far for câpân. That's all we got, and we're really excited to share it with you all and just to kind of invite you into this process. This has been really wonderful for me, and my sister to kind of stop and share this and kind of reevaluate and kind of think about where we came from and where we're going. And we also wanted to really include you all in that journey. So thank you so much for making the time to join us this lovely Sunday. I also want to thank the techs for making this possible, and everyone here at Theater Network, Brad, Hannah, Alana, Scott, Harley, everyone making this possible. We also want to thank Syncrude once again for making this whole thing possible. And once more, we want to thank you for joining us, and we'll be in touch. So thanks, everyone. Hi, hi.